Good evening. Sorry. Thank you, Sam. Good evening, everyone. My name's Kevin Singleton. I'm the Strategic Planning Manager, Herefordshire Council. Welcome to tonight's presentation. Thank you very much for giving up your time on what now is quite a pleasant evening. So, and as you can tell, we're recording the session tonight, and we will put it on the council's website subsequently. The session tonight is really the introduction to what is the second part, the second consultation period in what will be a relatively long period of preparation of the new local plan. This particular stage is really looking at alternative approaches to the county-wide planning policies, general planning policies that are within the local plan. The current plan is now 7 years old, so we need to check whether the existing policies are up to date, both in terms of what national policy says, but also in terms of local aspirations, things such as the county plan. We need to consider whether the policies could be written and be more effective, really, if they're redrafted, whether there are any key policy gaps, which would need additional policies or additional criteria added to existing policies. And when we're doing that, we have to bear in mind that the government's ambition is for shorter, more concise plans, which they see as being quicker to prepare and review. And the other thing that we would like to think about and start at the moment is at which level of plan making some of these policies should be set. Is it best to include them in the county-wide local plan, or are they better to sit within neighbourhood development plans and for the local plan to provide some guidance to parish councils and others about setting those policies in their neighbourhood plans? What we're going to do to start with is to update you with a brief high-level sort of summary of the results of the first consultation. We will be producing later in the year a more detailed report on all the consultations that we've undertaken. We thought we could share some of the high-level results at the moment. That will be followed by a series of 3 fairly short presentations on where we go through some of the sort of elements of the topics that we're covering in this consultation, and some sort of things that we're suggesting to you might want to consider in making your responses to us. Each of those sessions will be followed by a question and answer session, so to give you an opportunity to come back relatively early in that, and then we'll just close with a brief summary of next steps and so on. So we're intending on certainly not going any later than 9 o'clock, and it may be slightly earlier that we're able to finish. So I'm going to start by handing over to Sam Banks at the moment to cover the first part of the presentation on the summary of the consultation we held on spatial options earlier in the year. Okay, Sam. Okay. Thanks.
So hopefully you can all see the PowerPoint screen. So as Kevin says, I'm going to give you a very high level overview of the results that we had for the spatial consultation that happened in January, February. So some initial engagement statistics. So we had 2 websites running. We had our council website that had 814 visitors to it, and also our commonplace consultation platform, of which we had 3,624 visitors to that. So there were a lot of interest in that first part of the consultation. Those people made over 550, there were 550 respondents, so lots of people were obviously looking and visiting, but not necessarily making comment, but there were 550 respondents, and as you can see, that included a wide range of people, from members of the public, yourselves as parish councils, some of our neighbouring authorities, the statutory consultees, and also developers and planning consultants and various businesses. So they made a total of 954 comments to the spatial options, and we had about 25 site and settlement land submissions during that time. So the sort of high level preferences for the spatial option, as you can see there at 39%, came out as option 3, which was to concentrate growth on Hereford and the market towns. And you see the percentages for the other options there. Option 4 collectively is obviously 12%, but we asked the question about which of the growth towns, but as an option to focus on growth town, it was 12%. So for the rural options, this is slightly more balanced, as you can see. 30% obviously went for looking at focusing on settlements outside of the OMB or a conservation area. But after that, the percentages for option 2, which was focused on the larger settlements, option 1, which was the current strategy of spreading more dispersely, and option 3 of focusing on rural hubs was fairly even. So on the question we asked you about the vision, did you agree with our vision? As you see, 64% of the respondents said yes. And for the objectives, 63% said yes, they agreed with those. There were some comments about some tweaks to some of the wording we could make here and there, but generally people believed the vision and objective and supported those. So some recurring themes that came out of the consultation on travel, transport and movement was quite a high theme for people. There were lots of comments about making sure that there was investment in infrastructure and transport links across the county, that there should be an increased support for electric vehicles in developments, that we should consider various people across the community, but particularly those who have mobility issues, either disabled or elderly people, and how they actually found safe routes around the county. People did highlight the practicalities of more active travel. It may be easier in Hereford and the market towns than it is in many rural settings, and the potential for new development to be linked to railway stations and railway lines in particular. So a second recurring theme was about climate change and sustainability. People are keen on seeing those relationships between the protection of habitats and wildlife and the environment and the climate change. There's a lot of comments about drainage, flood defences, flooding in settlements, and where development should go in relation to that. A want for more renewable energy and sustainable heating methods in new developments, and enabling communities to look at the effect of climate change within their own neighbourhood plans and their own communities, and also issues about sustainable farming practices and protections of soil and runoff, and obviously the water phosphate issue within the lug. So the final recurring theme we saw was about housing and design. There were lots of emphasis on good quality of buildings and sustainable affordable housing. Opportunities to address various environmental issues, particularly in settlement hierarchy, where I think before people felt the environmental issues weren't taken into account. I recognise that technologies and working patterns and lifestyles have changed since the core strategy, and the way people move around and the way they work at home is very different to how it was. There was lots of comments about making sure you get the right houses in the right places, and a concern about potential second homes, Airbnbs, and making sure that housing in the county doesn't become unaffordable with those two aspects. And the need to ensure that any development has key services and is developed where those key services are. So it's just a really high level insight for you about the sorts of comments that we got back to the spatial options. So I'm going to hand over to Dan now, who's going to take you through the current policy consultation. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Good evening, all. We get to the introductory slides. Thanks. So yes, as Sam said, this presentation is to outline the next stage of the local plan update, the policy options public consultation, which commenced this Monday. And this consultation will close on the 16th of May. So we'll be asking for views on policies covering a number of themes. A further public consultation will then take place later in the summer, in which we'll gather views on the place-based options for Hereford, the market towns and the rural areas. So for this presentation today, we're going to cover 11 main policy themes in which we outline the main context and issues and raise some points for discussion. And then we'll go through these in 3 sections with breaks in between them to give you some time for some questions and answers. Although we'll be covering these as separate themes, we recognise there are many interlinks between them. So, for example, a climate change policy may focus on active travel, which also has benefits for healthy lifestyles and so on. And so the first theme we'll address this evening is going to be climate change. Dealing with the worldwide effects of climate change will be the biggest challenge our generation will ever face. The Climate Change Act sets out a legally binding target for the UK to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. In 2019, Herefordshire Council unanimously declared a climate and ecological emergency, setting a target of carbon neutral by 2030. Policy and guidance suggests that plans should take a proactive approach to mitigating and adapting to climate change, and this should be the top priority for planning. Significant areas of Herefordshire are low-lying and liable to flooding. Climate change will further increase the risk and events of flooding across the county. Herefordshire's rich biological and geological diversity has become increasingly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And on this slide, you can see that the average household consumption emissions of CO2 within Herefordshire are higher than the national average, which can be attributed to the rural nature of the county, with more oil-fired heating systems and general poorer access to public transport. So perhaps some points to consider in regards to climate change could be how can we ensure that the principles of mitigation and adaptation are fully addressed? Should the next local plan include detailed policy on climate change, or embed it through all local plan policies, or perhaps have a combination of both? And you'll see, as we discuss the other issues, that climate change is a recurring theme as interlinked to many other policies. So the next theme we'll discuss briefly is the natural and historic environment. The degradation of habitat and species is a national and local cause for concern. The Environment Act of 2021 seeks biodiversity net gain, a local nature recovery strategy to help address the problem. Our current green and blue infrastructure evidence is now out of date and requires updating to address the issues it can help with, such as climate change and flooding, the protection of water quality and the provision of sustainable drainage systems, or SUDs, biodiversity, and the enhancement of local landscape character. Local plans should recognise the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside, and that strategic policies should provide for the conservation and enhancement of landscapes. National guidance also states that local plans should set out a positive strategy for the conservation and enjoyment of the historic environment, including heritage assets most at risk through neglect, decay, or other threats. So from this, issues to consider within the natural and historic environment policy could be, should there be an option for a separate townscape policy as well as a dark sky policy? Should we be looking to maximise biodiversity net gain from 10%, or should we be looking to close the gap between strategic and local biodiversity policy rather than leaving it to neighbour development plans at the local level? Should we also consider a separate policy for biodiversity net gain that addresses many aspects of the plan? This can include areas such as transport proposals, housing and community infrastructure. Current green infrastructure policy is not well used, but needs updating in line with current guidance. So should the policy be strengthened to address all types and scales of developments? And finally, is the current policy framework for the historic environment broadly effective? Minor updates could be made to reflect the latest guidance, and we could strengthen the requirement for heritage impact assessments to support certain planning applications. So the next policy theme covers design. Design of buildings and places not only have a key role to play in aesthetics and sense of place, but also respond to the climate emergency and help to mitigate and adapt to a changing climate. Good quality and efficient housing, inclusive infrastructure, is key to enable communities to live healthy and active lives. Recent changes to national planning guidance, and such as the introduction of the new National Model Design Code and Guide, place focus on building better quality, well-designed places and buildings that are sustainable. So the image shown on the slide here shows the 10 characteristics of well-designed places within recent national government policy. Herefordshire was also selected to participate in the government's design code pilot, where design codes were tested on a local level with the participation of parish councils. Lessons learned from this valuable pilot study will be reflected in the new plan. So some issues to consider in design policy could be how do we create better and well-designed places in Herefordshire? Would this be by having more detailed policies in the local plan, or more place-based policies at the county level and local design guidance? How should we include local communities in design policy? Should parish councils continue to develop local policy through the neighbour development plans and develop design codes? How should design policies proactively deal with the climate emergency? Should policy promote low carbon and zero carbon developments in additional policy? So the next theme is in regards to transport. So there's been significant changes in national transport policy in the last 12 to 18 months or so. The Department of Transport recently published its decarbonising strategy for Britain. The government is to fully decarbonise transport by 2050 and to end sales of all combustion vehicles to cut CO2 emissions to zero. In the recent Levelling Up White Paper, one of the missions is by 2030, local public transport connectivity across the country will be significantly closer to the standards of London, with improved services, simpler fares and integrated ticketing. A new executive agency, Active Travel England, or ATE, has been launched this year. ATE will manage the National Active Transport Budget, awarding funding for projects which meet the new national standards. ATE will help local authorities in spreading good practice and will become a statutory consultee on major planning applications. Transport policies will need to be consistent with the Council's climate emergency to minimise our impact on the environment. The Hereford Master Plan was commissioned in February 2020 to assess the best options to provide a modern transport system for the city which will address the declared climate emergency, support the local economy, protect the environment and generate wider society benefits. The local transport plan to cover all of Herefordshire would also be updated in the next 18 months. Additionally, a transport scoping report is being commissioned. This is going to comprise of 2 stages. So stage 1 is going to consist of a high-level scoping assessment of the likely transport scenarios as outlined within the spatial options consultation. And then stage 2 will consist of a more detailed transport assessment once site capacities are known. And we're expecting the transport scoping report to be completed by the end of this summer. So points for discussion in regards to the transport policy could be the requirements of electric car charging points for new development proposals could be added to the transport policy, which will reflect the recent national and local policy changes since the existing core strategy was published. Reducing carbon emissions could also be added to the text to give greater emphasis to the climate change emergency. New developments will need to be designed to reduce the need to travel, to support active travel modes and also access to public transport. As we all know, Herefordshire is a rural county. Transport policy could perhaps put more emphasis on sustainable travel in the rural areas, such as introducing rural cycle highways. This could encourage more cycle use on our main A roads in the county. Perhaps also an additional policy could be drafted to reflect the National Design Code in relation to transport. So this could create great integration to the local plan policies on design and also to emphasise the importance of active travel and accessibility. A hierarchy of transport could also be referenced within this policy for development proposals. This could have aspiration to prioritise walking, cycling and public transport over the use of private cars. This would also be consistent with the Council's climate emergency declaration. So we will now be taking a pause on our policy options. You can see the last 4 themes. And so to summarise the things that we've just discussed were climate change, historical and natural environment, design, and also transport. Thanks.
What I suggest that if anyone's got a question on any of those themes at the moment, if you could raise your hand by using the reactions button at the bottom, that would be very useful for us. Mr. Davis, are you in charge of unmuting Sam?
I'm from Stoke Lacey. I was interested in the emphasis you appear to put on cycle cycle path in the rural area. It's an incredibly hilly county, so I would suggest that's a very small minority are really seriously going to be interested in that. And secondly, it seems to me that maybe more emphasis should be given on improving the public rights of way, because certainly around here they are physically used by people to move between their neighbours and between settlements, and it's quite challenging with some of the inadequacy of the provision that's been made available over the last few years. I wonder if that's rather more important than cycleways in rural areas.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Anyone else got a thought on any of those first 4 themes at the present? I mean, I think probably if there are cycleways, they'll be joint use. So I imagine they'll be able to be used for walking as well. But interesting point. That focus should be on the public rights of way rather than cycling routes.
Adrian, have you got your hand up?
I have indeed, Sam, yes. I don't know whether this is the appropriate place to ask this question, but I think there are some resourcing issues in terms of some of these ideas. I just want to check out what the response is to those. If we look, for example, about conservation and heritage, I mean, my parish, which is Kings Capel, has been trying to get action to designate a conservation area since 2006, and we are constantly told that there is no money for the authority to undertake this kind of work, even though I am a reasonably accomplished local historian and one of my fellow parishioners is quite a good architectural expert, and we've offered to help, but we still haven't got anywhere. And the second thing I would like to ask, and it relates particularly to things like transport, but other things as well, is the whole question of determining the relationship between the provision of infrastructure and facilities with the identification of suitable settlements for development. And I think we would like to see paragraph 8 of the Mppf becoming a kind of social charter, which says if you want the development, then you have to make positive efforts to fund the infrastructure and facilities. And that for us would include government responsibility in terms of making sure we have an adequate acute hospital in the county. And at the moment, in terms of its capacity and accommodation, we do not have that. Thank you. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Adrian, for that. I mean, in terms of, I would say in terms of the first point you raised about the sort of conservation and heritage and designation of conservation areas, and so that as a process is separate from the local plan process. It's covered by a different Act of Parliament and so on, but nevertheless that is something that the council is actively looking at and actively trying to identify a resource for at the moment. I think we'll probably be able to say more about that, or others will be able to say more about that shortly. But I will take that away and see if I can get a response back for you about that program of conservation area appraisals and so on that I know is being actively sought at the moment. In terms of the and I know that the other point that around infrastructure provision, yeah, it is something that you've already raised, I think, in previous consultations, and we are aware of that. I think clearly, as part of the consultation that we have across the county, we will be talking to health providers and so on. What we can't necessarily do, and I take the point that you're saying it's potentially a role for government there, is to say that we don't provide the housing requirement within the county based on whatever approach that is, because we think the hospital is not large enough. In theory, the NHS would be responsive to the level of growth that is proposed in the plan, and we would look at ensuring that they're aware of what's emerging through the plan, that they're able to comment on those levels of housing growth as we move forward, and that they're able to plan with their plan processes to accommodate that requirement over the plan period. That's the sort of natural way it is supposed to work. I understand you don't think it works in that way, but that is the way that the process is supposed to work in that regard.
Thank you.
John Davis.
Sorry, I'm being greedy and another one. This is more of a question to understand, actually. I either misheard or didn't understand the idea that Herefordshire had a greater CO2 problem because it was rural. I find that difficult to understand, in that I would have said if it was an urban county, an urban industrialised county, we would have had a far greater problem. I think it's often very easy to fall into the thinking that farming is to blame for everything, and I'm not a farmer, by the way, is that farming is to blame for everything. But in the crises we're seeing in the world at the moment, I think that probably government will be changing its policy on food security, and that farming, the attitude towards farming and land will be different. But I just don't understand the assumption that because we're a rural county, saying that our high CO2 is as a result of being, is caused by being a rural county. Makes no sense to me whatsoever. I'll just repeat, an urban industrialised county will produce far more.
Yeah, I think some of the data sort of suggests that we're higher than the national average in terms of household consumption, and sort of, as I sort of briefly mentioned, that is partly due to the rural nature, of the county, sort of the oil-fired heating systems, and because sort of rural nature, more public use of the private car and less access to public transport. Those sort of
but in an urban area, there'd be a hell of a lot of car usage. I just don't. What I'm concerned about is that policies may be made on an incorrect assumption from the data. I do not believe that that conclusion rather is the right conclusion from the data. I think there are probably other issues, probably associated with poor housing, etc. in the county. But there'll be many other factors like that. So I think it would be a shame if it was assumed that your conclusion was the right one. I don't think it is. And therefore, policy shouldn't be based on it.
What I'd say is probably that data is taken from sources that we can check, and we can go back and check that. I think it's more about clearly overall, you're right, in that if you've got a city of 1 million people, it's going to produce more carbon dioxide than a rural area with 170,000 people. But I think it's looking at per household, because of those, potentially because of that rural nature of the county. Now, per household, there's a high level of carbon dioxide emissions as a result of that. But we can check that. We can check those figures again. But I think they are taken from reputable sources to indicate that.
Now, I recognise the per household figure that was in there, but it just doesn't. It's not logical. So and I think it's a common problem. It's easy. It's become lazy thinking to say that farming and land use is a primary source of the problem. It's actually man's activities, not the activities of plants and animals. So I really would ask that this is checked, because I think it's a serious. If we start to base a lot of change in Herefordshire on the base that our rural county is producing loads of carbon dioxide from the wrong sources, we're going to spend a fortune for nothing.
Okay, thank you. Mr.
John
Tallis? Yeah, sorry.
Hello. Hi, Sam. Seen you. Long time since I've seen you. A couple of issues. On your first question about climate change and whether it should be covered on a general basis or a specific climate change policy, I would suggest it's got to be incorporated into everything and spread out, and because it has an effect on particularly the transport side. Following up on John Davis's comment about the models of the amount of CO2 per household, I sat through a presentation on a predicting model, which was looking at the individual parishes, and I was quite appalled at the assumptions that were made for our parish, for instance. One of the reasons why we had a high carbon footprint, because we took more foreign trips. That was, higher income for houses were making more travel in that nature, and that loaded it quite a lot. It was also quite difficult to see how you could affect it locally as a method as a parish to do something about climate change or carbon emissions. On the transport side, I can see it's a strong argument for having development concentrated around the city, because that's where the facilities are. People can more readily use active transport as it's described, i.e. walking and cycling. The idea of a small parish like Tarrington, which is 7 or 8 miles from anywhere, using bikes to get to Hereford or Ledbury or wherever is not practical. The road's too damn dangerous for a start, and there simply isn't enough transport. People use cars because they want to go somewhere other than the Hereford town centre or Ledbury town centre. They need to go to Foundhope because that's where one of the surgeries are, or Ledbury because the surgery's there. So we need a flexible transport system, probably on a smaller scale. I mean, I'm involved in the local transport, the community transport in Ledbury as a minibus driver. More transport of that nature, flexibly organised using modern computing techniques, and particularly if they were converted over to electric ones, would be much more efficient in terms of energy anyway. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
There's no more hands, Kev.
Is there anyone else? Should we move on to the next section of the presentation, which I think is going to be Carla.
David Jones would raise his hand.
Is that, sorry, I hadn't spotted that one. Mr. Jones, was it? But sorry, I've got a Mark Franklin raised his hand. Can you unmute?
Mute. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, fine. I mean, there's a lot. I guess part of the reason why there's many questions, there's an awful lot to take in in the presentation there. But one theme which did seem to come through to me is the question of whether these objectives are to be applied at sort of local level or at a county level, or what, or how they're going to work. Are they going to be guidelines, or are they going to be standards, or whatever? Because if you apply them too finely, you can paint yourself into a corner where it becomes impossible to develop anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the discussion is these will be planning policies that effectively will be used to judge planning applications against. So you're right that the more policies you have and the more detailed policies they are, the plan can more easily become out of date because things can change. But equally, if there's an important issue that's not covered by planning policy, then those proposals which can have a negative environmental effect or a negative effect in other regards can come forward, and those proposals can come forward and so on. So it's important to get that balance right, and that's what we're asking people to think about at the moment is have we got the balance right in terms of number of policies, the areas they covered, and the detail of those policies? Should we be looking at neighbourhood plans to include some of those policies rather than the county level policies and so on? So it's a good point about having things that are very detailed, which can easily become out of date and have not the impact that they were originally intended for.
I would think it'd be better for them to be more in the way of guidance rather than policies and restrictive policies to as few as possible. Otherwise, you're going to get in a situation where it may become impossible to build anything. It may be impossible to build a road without some biodiversity loss, for example. How is the county going to develop?
Yeah,
how are we going to get the investment that we need and the growth that we need to support the services that we want?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it's a good point. There will be a requirement in the coming out of the new Environment Act for all development to bring forward environmental net gain, and that'll be interesting to see how that pans out and what guidance we get from government to ensure that is facilitated and brought forward in the counties. But thank you for that point.
Okay.
Is there anyone else, or should we move to the second part of the presentation? Okay, that's Carla, I think.
Yeah, hello, good evening. Great. So the next theme we'll be exploring is housing. Housing affordability is a significant issue in the county, and the lack of affordable housing greatly limits opportunities for younger and lower income households to able to afford to buy their own home, which presents a significant obstacle to achieve social mobility. Housing affordability in mix still remains a particular issue in the more rural areas. A recent survey of parish councils, this in February 2022, frequently highlighted a lack of affordable units being delivered in their areas. This is in part due to the sizes of development that come forward in these areas, typically having small-scale sites, only under 10 dwellings. These are insufficient in scale to be able to trigger national policy requirements to contribute to a range and mix of housing types and tenures. Another topic is there's been a travelling community in Herefordshire for the last 500 years. Travellers live in different ways, including permanently on the road, in caravans or mobile homes, or in settled accommodation for part or for all of the year. It is recognised that there is a lack of availability of sites in comparison to finding sites for settled housing, and this can create issues in terms of location on new sites in the county. A Gypsies and Travellers Accommodation Assessment, GTAA, is underway, and we will expect the findings soon. This should tell us how many travellers' pitches there are and show Pearson's plot will be required. And the government is also keen to promote alternative means of delivering housing to boost supply and widen choice. One example of which is providing more plots for self-build projects. So if you go on to our next slide, points for discussion are what types of specialist housing are required to respond to the needs of the local population. Another point of discussion could be, has national policy on affordable housing in rural areas prevented some housing in the rural areas? In what ways can we address the lack of affordable housing in those rural areas? Also, how can we identify good sites for the travelling community? And how can housing policies proactively promote alternative means of affordable housing and delivery? for example, self-build, community-led housing projects. So if we go on to our next slide, the next topic will be community, open space and health. Numerous studies have concluded a direct link between happiness and the quality of living environments, especially links to green spaces and nature. The impact sport and physical activity can have on mental well-being is every bit as important as the physical benefits. Open spaces can have other invaluable uses relating to the preservation of species and a tool in tackling climate change, especially playing a part in flood mitigation strategies and carbon reduction. Some statistics in regards to community engagement, physical activity and open space are shown here in the diagram. The main issues the local plan will need to address is the local plan must ensure that all Herefordshire's communities have good access to community and health services. New development should be designed in a way to enable healthy and active lifestyles for all across Herefordshire. Another important point is maintaining good quality open spaces for a range of sports and recreational purposes, as well as extending green and blue infrastructure networks. And that will be a key requirement. So some of the points to discuss would be, how can we ensure that the land use planning promotes good health and well-being in the county? How can we ensure that existing social and community facilities in the county are retained? How do we need a different approach for this to different areas of the county, such as rural and urban areas? Will they be, will they differ in the approach? How can open space incorporate opportunities to allow biodiversity to thrive? Are there opportunities for rewilding, for example? Also, how can we ensure that health issues are embedded throughout the plan? Healthy living is key to successful communities. How can open space accommodate more community growth and other sustainable food production practice to support community cohesion? So there's some sort of ideas to discuss when we come to our Q&A. So the next area will cover housing in rural areas. So Herefordshire is a truly rural county. 53% of the population lives in rural areas. So National Policy and Guidance, Mppf, National Planning Policy Framework, indicates that planning policies should be responsive to local circumstances and support housing that reflects local needs. Housing needs should be identified for villages to grow, thrive and support local services. Policies also need to seek to resist the unsustainable development of isolated homes in the countryside. Feedback received from our recent questionnaire suggests to us that a set of criteria for what constitutes as exceptional design quality with regards to allowing dwellings in the open countryside should be defined in policy. There is an opportunity for policy to make reference to potential self-build dwellings in these locations. We can also explore the potential to impose limits on the size of isolated countryside dwellings. We can also examine opportunities for carbon reduction where possible in these policies. In regards to the conversion of rural buildings, the feedback that we got from our questionnaires recommended that policy should be strong and robust enough to ensure that the conversion of buildings is done in a sort of sustainable way in sustainable and suitable locations. Also, we can look at the issue of redundancy to determine whether a policy could include criteria requiring applicants to demonstrate the redundancy of buildings. This is to prevent the conversion of recently constructed buildings for alternative uses. However, there are limits. National guidance, so Class Q in the PD rights, means it's difficult to control the development of agricultural buildings in many instances, so that may cause some sort of issues. Another sort of policy relating to the rural economy. So the economy in rural areas could provide policies relating to agricultural and food production developments within the countryside, for an example. So points for discussion: should policies for the rural areas only be updated to reflect current national guidance? Should any of the policies relating to developments in the open countryside take more of a local place-based approach? Or should additional policies regarding size standards be added to the rural areas policies? Should additional policies be added regarding adaptable living opportunities within the open countryside? Or should there be additional specifically for seasonal workers accommodation. So the next topic is, I'm sure, a topic most of you will know quite well. It's neighbourhood planning, and we're going to discuss the role of neighbourhood planning going forward in the county. So Herefordshire, as you know, has taken a very positive approach to neighbourhood planning since the introduction of the Localism Act. And we've had a really sort of enthusiastic and engaged take-up rate, with a large proportion of parishes across the county taking and engaging in neighbourhood planning. So overall, there's 89% of the parishes in Herefordshire have done a neighbourhood plan or doing a neighbourhood plan. It's important that as the new local plan is produced, that the new and updated neighbourhood plans generally conform to the new county-wide policies. So after 10 years in practice, it's appropriate that we need to review the role in neighbourhood plans play going forward, and how these align with the next local plan. So from this, a number of options could be considered of how neighbourhood plans go forward. So the current level of local distinctive policy making at parish and community level have been relatively successful. You've had community inputs and engagement. There's a significant number of neighbourhood development plans in Herefordshire, and they form the basis for review of emerging local plan strategic policies. So should we continue with this approach, or do you think neighbourhood plans should play a different role going forward? It has been raised in the questionnaire by town and parish councils that one area has proved locally contentious and requires the most technical support, which would be identifying and allocating development sites. So that, again, this raises the question, do we revert the site allocations and settlement boundary delineation back to the local plan authority? Should that decision be made at a local plan level, core strategy level, or should it remain within the neighbourhood plans? However, on that side, it could undermine the underlying principle of neighbourhood planning, in that communities are able to shape places in which they live through those allocations and settlement boundaries. Town and parish councils, there's another way of they could potentially prepare design codes for their local area rather than a neighbourhood plan. As Dan mentioned previously in the design slide, there was a pilot with testing potential design codes in local communities. So that's another option. This would follow the government guidance within the National Model Design Code and National Model Design Guide. With this approach, all other aspects of local policies will be covered in the new local plan. However, this may be seen as a backward step after the success of so many locally produced neighbourhood plans and policies in the last decade. So this now we'll take a question and answer session. We'll take a pause on these policy options, and we'll consider and discuss the last 4 themes we've gone through. So housing, community open space and health, rural areas, and the role of neighbourhood planning. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand.
Adrian?
Thank you. Yes, I'd just like to make 3 brief comments. According to the figures that I've looked at, it appears that 64% of housing completions in the last 10 years have been in rural areas. And yet at the same time, the council has removed almost entirely the subsidy for rural bus services, which means that the public transport, which is particularly important for people who need to live in more affordable housing, just isn't there. There is also the question of the housing mix. The housing mix that was suggested in the GL Hearn housing market assessment was very rigorous, and there was a particularly strong paragraph in the core strategy about housing development in rural areas being skewed too much in the development to the development of expensive and large homes. I was disturbed to read the housing market assessment that appeared last year from Mycenae, which seemed to me to confuse housing need with housing demand, and to suggest solutions which simply took account of the previous 10 years of planning approvals given. And I believe, forgive me for being controversial, it would be better if the county consigned certain parts of that more recent housing market assessment, particularly on housing mix, to the dustbin. As far as neighbourhood planning is concerned, I would like to say that I think Herefordshire has been enormously supportive in that, and a great deal of thanks is due to Sam Banks and her team. It would, of course, have been much better if we had been writing our neighbourhood development plans against a rural settlement hierarchy, which made more sense. And I hope that will be possible in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
For anyone that doesn't know where the hand raising is, if you go to the bottom, there's a reactions button. If you press that, you'll see the little hand. But if you can't find it, if you just turn your video on, wave at us, we will be able to see you. John, is that a clap or is that a waving hand?
Sorry, the technology is beyond me. I did want to just make a comment. It was about rewilding. The rewilding's been in the news a great deal of recent times, particularly with celebrities buying who are rich enough to buy up large acreages and with a view of rewilding them. If we do that, we're all going to starve. I think the thing about rewilding is to use it intelligently in locations which are poor, largely poor agricultural land. I'm sorry, I'm not a farmer. I'm just a rural liver. Okay, so I don't want to sound as if I'm standing up for the farming lobby, but I'm standing up for food security, which is the next big issue to hit us after energy. I think as long as we have, I'm agreeing with the idea of rewilding, but it's something that needs to be thought through very carefully and shouldn't be just applied willy-nilly across valuable land which can produce food. We will be in trouble. In terms of the neighbourhood planning, I think that the idea of having site allocation and settlement boundaries taken away from NDPs wouldn't go down very well, certainly with us. I think I'm not quite sure about where the design responsibility should lie, but in terms of site allocations and settlement boundaries, I think that's a key local democracy issue.
Thank you, John. Any other questions, or should we move on to the next section? Yeah. Hand over to Vic.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, the last three little bits we're going to look at are concerned firstly with employment. So the employment section of the plan, which will include policies concerned with certain issues, including, for example, the provision of employment land, the safeguarding of the county's best employment land, and possibly enabling home-based working, for example. But first of all, to put a little bit of background on the Herefordshire, in the national context in terms of employment, Herefordshire has got the lowest economic output of any county in England, and that's 19% below the national average. Yet at the same time, it benefits from relatively low unemployment levels. But Herefordshire does, however, have a low wage economy and a deficit of higher skill levels, as well as an ageing population and a general shortage of labour. So in the core strategies plan period so far, there's actually been quite an under-delivery of new employment sites, with only one of the strategic employment allocations having come forward so far. A key piece of evidence that will be informing the content of the emerging local plan, covering the period up to 2041, will be the Herefordshire Employment Land Requirement Study. and that's being carried out by a company, BE Limited. That study is underway currently, and it's going to be providing crucial up-to-date evidence on employment land needs across the county, the availability of potential employment sites, and it will also conclude with a set of recommendations for appropriate policy approaches that we might wish to take. An important shift in the national planning policy with regards to employment that will affect the approach that we take in the new local plan are the changes which were made to the use classes order that came into effect in September 2020. And those alterations allow for increased permitted development rights, so people making changes to buildings without the need for planning permission. And these might mean that a change of policy approach might be necessary if the local plan is going to continue to be able to safeguard the highest quality employment sites in the county from being lost to other uses. Another thing to consider when we're looking at the employment section is the importance that creative and green technology sectors have and the key role that they play in the transition to a low carbon economy. But quite a few examples if you're not quite sure what I mean by that. So things like solar roof tiles or the smart flower solar panels, living buildings, vertical or indoor farming, vertical axis wind turbines, biodegradable burial pods, edible plastic alternatives, and even energy harvesting floorboards, to name just a few. So policies could be included in the local plan which would proactively support and attract these types of industries to the county, and that might be something that we may wish to see. So when you're thinking about your responses to this consultation, here are some questions that you might want to consider in relation to the employment policies section of the local plan. Should policies primarily aim to decarbonise the local economy and seek to promote creative and green technologies? Should the local plan seek to specifically protect existing land that's in employment use? Or should the employment section of the plan have a separate policy which enables home working and home-based businesses? The next topic we're going to look at is in relation to retail and how the plan might address town centre type issues. Because it's quite apparent to everybody, I'm sure, that the way people use town centres has undergone significant changes in recent years. And the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated that already existing shift away from physically visiting shops to shopping online from the comfort of your sofa. And this leads us then to consider how town centres may take on new functions, becoming more places for social and leisure activities rather than simply shopping destinations. And as I mentioned before, in September 2020, the use classes order had an overhaul, and there were new classes introduced which cover commercial, business and service uses, and they supersede the previous use classes that we had. And we've also seen the introduction of a new class MA, which permits changes from certain classes to residential, with some exceptions such as pubs and listed buildings. But the intention of these changes is to bring about some greater flexibility in town centres and hopefully respond to these changing shopping habits that are occurring at the moment. As part of the local plan update, we've commissioned town centre and retail assessment for the plan period. And this is to make sure that the evidence base that we use to develop our emerging policies and proposals is both accurate and up to date. The assessment is due to be completed by early summer of this year. So some more points to think about in relation to the development of town centre policies could be possibly the use of the existing primary shopping area designations. Is that something that could be reviewed? And this traditional role of retail being the main function of the town centres being in transition? And do we need to ask, does a designation such as a primary shopping area still reflect a modern town centre's changing role? Should we be looking to allow more diversification of uses permitted in town centres? This might make them more resilient and more flexible in the future. And additionally, with the changes that are in permitted development, There may be opportunities to draft an additional policy about the upper floors within town centre buildings for residential and office use, because I understand that there have been quite a few concerns about housing that's been permitted in this way in the past. The last of the topics that we're going to look at today is tourism. And tourism obviously plays quite an important role in the economy of Herefordshire. It accounts for over 5,000 jobs in the county. And a challenge for the planning system is how development proposals can best be supported in the local plan without having adverse impacts upon Herefordshire's natural and historic assets, because they are in themselves central to the county's visitor appeal. There's an increasing demand for proposals for these less traditional forms of visitor accommodation, such as glamping sites or woodland cabin parks in the rural parts of the county. And there will be many people who are going to be proposing such tourist type development in the rural areas, because these are the locations attracting the visitors. But when we're looking in terms of sustainable development, there are going to be tensions between this principle of sustainability, which usually directs proposals to larger settlements in the county, and the numerous applications for new developments in the open countryside. So we need to know how to balance those in terms of policy formulation. Should the plan possibly also provide a definition of exactly what sustainable tourism is, so that both applicants and the public can understand what may be acceptable in policy terms through the plan? A few points of view to consider when you're thinking about making your comments on tourism policy that's emerging could include: should the local plan seek to define sustainable locations in which rural visitor accommodation can be permitted? Or should the local plan, or possibly a supplementary planning document, provide specific guidance on tourist accommodation, such as these glamping sites or forestry cabins? So that brings us to the end of the presentation that we've got for you tonight, and I'll now give you the opportunity to ask any questions that you might have on those final three themes of employment, town centres and retail, and tourism. Thank you. David James.
Hello. Yeah, I was just going down back to the retail and talking about shopping centres not being very busy, but in smaller towns like ours in Bromyard, the high street is a very important part of the town. And I won't say it's thriving, but it's certainly not dying. And there's a lot of older people who wouldn't dream of going into Hereford or Worcester. And the necessary shops like the butchers and the bakers, etc., are doing thriving business. And not only that, they are really needed and far from dying. There's very few empty shops within our high street. So it's not dying. They are needed. These things come around once in a while, and obviously COVID did impact everybody in a big way, but I found we've been quite busy and thriving rather than dying off.
So David, if I could ask there, it's Kevin again, Kevin Singleton. You see a role for continuing to protect the retail function in town centres?
I beg your pardon, sorry?
You see a role to continue to protect the retail element of town centres?
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's all right saying should they be used for leisure facilities, and that there is room for that. But to me, that would probably keep people away as well. It seems a lot of the shopping centres where you go, if a shop closes, a leisure centre opens, but you hardly ever see anybody using the gyms, and that's maybe I'm just going through at the wrong time. But no, I really think that people, and we're talking about tourism. When you go into a town, I always said, and when our toilets were out of action in Bromyard, in fact, it was a thing that made that I was encouraged to get to be a councillor for. I said, as soon as you arrive in a new town, the first thing you look for is a toilet, park the car and where can I shop? And I think for some people, it's probably shopping first. So yeah, I really think that there's room for a good retail environment, and I think if they're attractive, people will come.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's really very interesting to hear that, because obviously those smaller market towns, particularly Bromyard or Kington, say, they're not the same as what we as planners might be reading about happening in the larger cities and the way they develop their centres, which are changing quite a lot. So that's really interesting to hear. Thank you.
Yes, I'm just following up on that. Yes, I think that I think the evidence, there's some evidence in it from the footfall data that it's correct that the sort of smaller towns have done better. Perhaps people more working from home, and it's actually been the larger centres have actually suffered more during the last few years. But yes, that's an interesting point. Thanks for raising it.
John Davis.
I would concur that I think there's a difference between the city and the local towns, which seem to be relatively thriving. I'm sure that a housing mix in the centre of Hereford would help some of its problems. Low employment, I think until we've got an infrastructure which allows employers to have easy access to their suppliers and easy access to their customers, will struggle to get our employment rates and pay up significantly. It's a significant strategic issue. It's not one for tinkering with at the edges. It is about the infrastructure and failures, for example, on the bypass. Many of the SMEs form the background of the economy in the country, and I know I started my business in a back room of the house, and it eventually moved out into bigger premises. So for that reason alone, apart from all of the other issues that have been in the public domain about the benefits or otherwise of home working is encouragement of that is a massive start, a help for small businesses that are just setting out. So I think if for no other reason, that's a reason why anything that helps home working should be encouraged. I certainly would like a definition of sustainable tourism. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Mark Franklin.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'll pick slightly from the point that John's made. We talked about wanting to attract green jobs to the county. Well, of course everybody would. We're going to be in competition with lots of other counties, lots of other towns and cities to do exactly that. So why should they come to Herefordshire if we're not providing the other things that they need, the infrastructure, the roads, the schools, the hospitals, all those major developments that they need? So, that can't be dealt with really on a local basis. It's got to be dealt with at least on a county basis, and there's got to be a major plan, I think, to do that. John mentioned the bypass, and I won't open that argument up again, but I have to say that in turning away 250 million pounds of investment, you sent a signal to potential investors that we're not really open for business. We don't want investment. So we need to change that signal and indicate to potential investors how we're going to support them. Why should they come to Herefordshire? We want them to do that, but you can't tie them up in too much planning regulation either. Are we going to turn down any development, any potential investment that say might create 500 jobs if it isn't carbon zero or carbon neutral? How's it going to work?
Thank you for that. Thank you. I think there's recurring comments coming tonight from around that theme, so that's good. Any other comments at the moment?
Lorraine? You're on mute, Lorraine.
Thank you. Are we making any distinction between sort of independent shops and sort of the national chains? Because I know a lot of the national chains have sort of, some have folded. And I think historically in Herefordshire, we've struggled to sort of be a big enough city, I think, to sort of attract some of them. It took a long time for us to get C&A, for instance, and another long time for us to get Debenhams, and now both have gone. So I don't know. I just feel that there is a place for retail in our city and in our market towns, and that's also part of our tourism efforts as well. I mean, you know, shopping isn't just it is a leisure activity as well. So yeah, I think we should retain and support our retail in our towns and the city itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Hi, thank you. I wanted to raise three things here. One is my comments about the changing nature of our cities. I do particularly think Hereford, I haven't been into Ludlow recently or Leominster, but there's an enormous amount of space given over to retail. And as you say, it's actually also to those big chains who have failed in quite a big way over COVID. I would give you Ledbury as the most fantastic and wonderful example of a really good retail centre and an expanding residential centre as well, which must surely be meeting quite a lot of your needs for accessibility in every way. There is an area which I think I've missed. I probably wasn't listening closely enough, but there seems to me to be a big problem about allocating space for housing without any consideration of whether or not there's any water services or sewerage services around. And we've already hit problems like that in the parish I look after, which is Linton. And I think it's a really big issue that we haven't quite dealt with. And the final thing I wanted to raise is, what evidence is there that the explosion of desire to use Herefordshire as a holiday resort is going to continue once people are allowed to get back on EasyJet flights to Spain?
Thank you. I suppose the final point was the sort of question. I suppose it's just about having a suite of policies in the plan that will be able to enable us to deal with any proposals that come forward. Really, so I don't think we're necessarily thinking of proposing any major sort of tourism sites or proposals, but it's about having a suite of policies that can be used to when a planning application comes in, to deal with that planning application in a way that demonstrates that the proposal is sustainable, that it doesn't have implications necessarily in terms of the environment that we wouldn't want to have. So it's about getting that suite of policies in place. So we're not necessarily saying there will be some huge explosion of tourism. What we're trying to do is trying to establish what policies are required to deal with any proposals that will come forward for whether that be for tourist accommodation or tourist attractions within the county. Any other points that people wanted to raise? So, or if not about the last three, if someone's thought of something about an earlier point or an earlier topic that was raised, does anyone want to make ask a question or make a comment now before we sort of wrap up? John Tallis.
Can I comment about the earlier suggestion about design codes being devolved down to parish councils? It sounds to me like something that's rather too technical that most parish councils to be able to deal with. all right, if you're just going to revert back to the national guidance, that's one thing. But I think it really needs to be done at a higher level where there's more expertise about.
Thank you, John. Sam, is it worth touching on the pilot and what that looked at?
Yeah, so Hereford was successful to win a bid for Pilot 1. And some of you, I know Lorraine in particular, was involved in that pilot. So we looked at whether design coding could be integrated into the neighbourhood planning process and whether you could add design coding into the work that you were already doing when you were producing your neighbourhood plan. So we've looked at producing a set of guidance notes and templates in the same way as we did when you started the neighbourhood plan process, about how you went around and looked at the place you live, certain characteristics from that 10 characteristic wheel from the National Design Code, and what you would need to do to find the baseline data. Now, one of the things we did find, and I'm sure Lorraine will agree, is actually, as you rightly say, John, it is quite technical. There is the issue about how you prove a popular design code. You know, when there's 400 of you in the village and you've all got slightly different views, as you know from the neighbourhood planning world, it's quite difficult. But when you're talking about something that is quite subjective and people have personal preferences for certain types of styles and certain types of design, how you equate that and you will come up with one code. So that is one of the difficult issues that we were looking at when we did the pilot. But it is something that national government are plugging quite heavily at the moment. It is already been integrated into the Mppf. And I think there is going to be a further push during the next plan period about having more design codes. So as part of the options, what we're doing is asking all of you as parish councils, would you like to take on that role as part of your neighbourhood planning work, or should it stay with the local authority, as you say, with maybe some of the more place shaping technical staff that we have? Now, we don't have any urban designers, as you will know, that we've often struggled with some of our technical support officers as far as conservation team are concerned. There's been quite a few vacant posts there recently. So even in-house, we're struggling with some of those technical expertise that we may need to produce design coding on quite a large scale.
Thank you, Sam. Lorraine, did you want to say a few words, and then I'll bring John back in, maybe?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of speak from experience, really, and just say, obviously, as Sam has just said, we were part of the pilot, and it's I think it's something possibly that it would be better for parishes to do, because that they know their own places better, similarly as they do in any aspect really of the neighbourhood development plan. There obviously needs, some things need ironing out, I think, as to how it's done, but it's and there's a certain onerous quality to it, as again with the rest of the neighbourhood plan policies that were put together. But I guess we know our own places better than perhaps the city or Herefordshire Council probably does. I mean, I know we were visited by Carla, and it was interesting to see, because ourselves, we look at our villages because we live there all the time. We don't necessarily see things, so it opened our eyes to what was already there. So it was a good exercise in as much as we understood our parishes a lot more, or our villages a lot more. So and sometimes having a stranger look at it, for instance, Carla came and she spotted things that we hadn't noted before. So it's looking at in more depth at your village, but it helps you to know it a lot better. So I think there are benefits to doing the design plan, because then you're more in control of your own area, because they all vary. With all sort of different villages of different sort of characteristics. Thank you.
Right. John, did you want to come back?
I'll follow up a little bit. Part of my reasoning was that the numbers involved in our village are likely to be low. One hopes it's not going to be in the low tens of houses over the next maybe 10 years beyond the current NDP period. Therefore, the impact you're going to have by improving those few houses is going to be light. And I'm thinking more in terms of design for sustainability, energy usage and things like that. The other thing is what I've seen on a recent development where there was about 25 houses being built, and the actual way that they've met the environmental considerations were very, very lightweight. Provision of bike sheds, for instance, and perhaps some power electric car charging points, but that's about it. Nothing else. No improvement to the actual standard of the buildings. Looking at how they're being built, they don't look particularly like any of the other houses in the village. Although we are a very mixed village, from the odd black and white to brick to, you know, so there's not a consistent style. So saying the design code from the visual point of view is probably quite difficult and maybe not possible. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Is there anyone else? David?
Yeah, just a couple of things. First of all, on the transport situation, just to go back to it, we were talking.
David's muted, I think.
So, sorry,
yes, yeah.
We were talking about cycle lanes, which I think most people are generally in agreement are okay in certain parts, but not others. But no mention of buses. I mean, in Bromyard, we can't even get to Malvern. We can't get to Ledbury. More important, they can't get to us, you know, and you can't get much more green than using a bus. The other thing is on the housing, because I don't know if I'm a little confused, but as I still understand it, in Hereford, we're not allowed to build any more houses at the moment anyway, until the phosphates are sorted out. Am I right in saying that?
Clearly there's a significant restriction in parts of the north of the county as we stand. The expectation, now we're preparing this plan on the expectation that will be resolved, and we will be able to build again. But clearly that is a challenge that we'll have to meet as we develop the plan. So at the moment, it's not all of Herefordshire. It's the north of the county that is impacted on by that. But we're actively trying to resolve that issue, and we hope to do so in the early part of the plan period. We're looking at the next 20 years here, so if we're not able to build within the county in the next 20 years, then there'll be major social and economic impacts that would come about because of that.
And again, to the housing themselves and the standards, as we've just been talking about, our friend from Stoke Lacey, I often drive through, and there's some lovely new houses there, but I haven't seen one solar panel there. And to me, if we're talking about being green and everything, that's about the most basic thing every house should probably be fitted with, as well as a window or a door. As well as charging points and charging points around town. I was reading something interesting in the paper yesterday. This gentleman had got a car, but you can't just use any charging point. You've got to have one suitable for your car now. It's ridiculous, you know. But I think the main thing is any house that's being built ought to automatically have a solar panel, at least one on it, and charging facilities for all the electric cars we've got to get. So.
Thank you.
That's what I think.
Thank you.
John Davis.
Could I pick up on a couple of points that have been made? David James, I'm pleased to drive through Stoke Lacey often. You'd be interested to know that the houses actually have underground, have got ground source heating. So they've made a gesture in that regard. As far as they're nice houses, it's interesting that they are nice houses, both inside and outside, but they're entirely in the wrong place. The design is not that, their external design is not that of the village or its surrounding area. And so coming onto the point of design codes, I understand the point that John Tallis makes about maybe there are technical issues when it comes to design, But we, as Sam knows, we're in Stoke Lacey, we're well in the middle of our NDP at the moment. And one of the most fascinating areas, and one of the areas in which we have found, interestingly, the most agreement is in the design codes that we put forward, which are trying to reflect the historic building design of the region. So I'm not entirely sure that it is so technical that we should not take local democratic responsibility for it. But thank you for this meeting, by the way. It's very good.
Yes.
Thank you, John. Yeah, no, that's good. Anyone else? Last chance, I suppose, really, to raise your hand now. No, okay, that's great. Well, again, I found it really interesting and really, well worth having the session this evening. So thank you all for participating. We're going to run another one with parishes next week as well, and hopefully that will be well attended, and we'll have some stimulating debate there as well. The consultation continues until mid-May. And we encourage as many responses to it as possible. Our preference is obviously to use our questionnaire, but we recognise that doesn't always necessarily meet what everyone wants to say, and so people can email responses into us, or even send them in. Although, as I say, it makes it a lot easier if people use the digital platform that we've got. In the next few weeks, we will be writing to parishes just to check that the sort of audit of services and facilities that we've got currently is as up to date as it possibly can be. This is a sort of factual check, and it would be really useful if parishes could get back to us on that by about the 22nd of April, because we're looking at using that to help us with looking at the new settlement hierarchy that we'll probably consult upon in the summer. So the summer consultation is likely to be more detailed, looking at individual places, that's the city, market towns, and rural settlement hierarchy options for the rural areas. That will run through June and July. So again, this is just a plea really, if parishes could get back to us on that audit, and just I think it's mainly checking that the information we've got is predominantly up to date. But again, from me, I'd just like to thank all the participants tonight for taking the time to come along and listen to us and to give us your views. And I suppose that ultimately we're looking at trying to get a plan in place for middle of 2024, which sounds a long way away, but in local plan preparation terms, that's very quick, and hence why we've got this quite accelerated series of consultations that we're trying to get through at the moment. And I know we're asking a lot of parishes to get back to us in as short space of time as possible, but to maintain the momentum in preparing the plan, that's something that we've got to do, I'm afraid. So thank you all, and I look forward to reading your responses in full when they come in.